As you all learned last week, there's a connection with our presenter from last week who used to be Morgan's sort of boss, right? I mean, a little bit. So we're grateful for Emporia State for getting you guys here to Baylor and getting us here to St. Albans. And so, Morgan, we're just happy for you to share with us this morning.
Thank you so much. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to share a little bit about my work. I'm so grateful to Andrew for the invite, for my colleagues that are here, and for all of you that decided to attend today. I wanted to share a little bit about not only my current work, but a little bit about how I got there. And so I'm originally from South Carolina. I grew up just below Charlotte, and that experience really shaped who I am today and a lot of the work that I make. And I attended the University of South Carolina in Columbia for my BFA before actually coming to Texas. I studied at Texas Women's University for my MFA, both in photography. In addition to photography, my MFA included a minor in intermedia. And so a lot of times people ask me, what do you do? What's your career? And many years ago, I stopped saying photographer. I'm not really a photographer, how you might think when you hear that term. Instead, I'm an artist who uses photography, but I also use other media. And I think both my upbringing as well as my experiences in graduate school, exploring printmaking, bookmaking, and papermaking were all really instrumental, especially in the work that I'm making now. So I wanted to start by talking about callings. So last week, Andrew said something about this idea of callings, and immediately that piqued my interest. It was like thinking about my experiences compared maybe with many other artists. Some people in their discipline it may take many years, it may take going to school to figure out what they want to do. I'm one of those rare people that I've known what I've wanted to do almost my entire life. My earliest memories from my childhood are of art making. And for as long as I can remember, I wanted to be an artist. In fact, my backup career idea was okay, maybe I'll be a doctor if this art thing doesn't work out. And I mention that because that additional interest in medicine, in science, in history, all informs the work that I make and has continued to inform the work that I make and how I continue to grow and things that I'm interested in learning more about. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm interested in art and in science. But even more importantly than that, part of what shaped my upbringing is this feeling of out of place, not feeling like I belonged. Growing up in the South, what it meant to be a woman, these ideas that were impressed upon me, constantly made me question who I was and what was my identity. So I've spent most of my career as an artist, as an academic, exploring women's identity in a variety of facets. I've done this through a number of different media, photography primarily being my primary medium. Now, when I went to school, just to share a little bit of backstory about my experiences, just generally in education, this is one thing I like to share with my students, is thinking about how these different classes you take when you go to college can really inform you long term. One of my very first courses I took was a women's studies course, my very first semester in undergrad. And that was, for me, an aha moment. Because finally, I heard people talking about and studying aspects of women's identity that I could relate to. I no longer felt like this person who was out of place, who wasn't feminine enough, who would never be womanly enough. I finally understood and began to study that in greater detail. And so in that sense, I had to follow that calling. And I've found that over and over again in my artwork. When I feel moved by something in a deep way that I feel called to make work about it, if I don't answer that, I can't move on to the next thing. I have to follow it all the way through until I feel like it's complete. So in graduate school and after graduate school, for many years, I specifically explored women's identity as it relates to beauty and how advertising language impacts how we understand ourselves as women, how we see ourselves as women, and how it's essentially intended not to make us feel better about ourselves, but to make us feel worse in the fact that we can buy these products that will help us become beautiful, that we have to apply things, we have to mask our natural identity in order to become something. So I'm really interested in how language can impact us. This also connects back to another class I took in undergrad in linguistics. And this is one of the most fabulous things about a liberal arts education, our cross-listed courses. It was linguistics, it was English, it was women's studies, and it was, I think, anthropology. But in this course, it really got me thinking about words and the meaning behind words. And that's something else that's been a constant throughout my work. Once I had my daughter in 2011, I started to also think a lot about my identity as a mother and her identity as a girl, and our relationship and how that connected. So I began in 2018 to begin to explore work about motherhood, and that's what I'm doing today. I'm really focused intently on our relationship and expressing our identity. But I show these two works to you, number one, because this was a huge transition point for me. I've always been interested in book arts, and I have an example of one of my books up there, and I have a very short series that I did exploring the landscape of the body connected with child development, but I was intentionally hand embroidering onto the surface of my prints. And within this work, I was highly inspired. My spouse couldn't be here today, but if he was, he'd probably be groaning because I'm about to say this, but I listen to a lot of podcasts. I like to tell people about that because I love to learn. I'm a super nerd. And one of my favorite podcasts is Radiolab. I listened to that for a really long time, and it bridges science and history and art, and it merges it through storytelling, which I think is what I'm really drawn to. But in a Radiolab episode, and it was just like a snippet at the introduction, it wasn't even what the episode was about. They mentioned something, one of the hosts mentioned something called microchimerism. And essentially when a woman becomes pregnant, with each pregnancy, no matter how long you're pregnant for, pieces of DNA can break off. And then they reside in your body as a woman for up to 40 years. So for up to 40 years, I carry my child with me. And so when I first heard this was probably more like 2015. I didn't really know what to do with this, but I kind of kept thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about how we are connected to our children and how this is a long-term experience as womanhood, as motherhood for women. I also want to mention some of my influences. For me, I have long been invested in art history. Even if my work doesn't look like there's a direct connection, I can acknowledge now the significant influence of especially works from the Renaissance and the Baroque, which many of you might be familiar with when thinking about artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, some of the great artists that we think of within the canon of Western art. And these were certainly major influences, but even more so as I studied art in school and as I then taught art as a professor, I started to look at other artists as well. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is this long-term representation of mother as like this Madonna figure, the significance and how we're cherished, so seeing this figure as a symbol of not only fertility and life, but of care. And I'm really interested in that idea of care. So these are two examples, a work by Artemisia Gentileschi called Annunciation and a piece by Andrea Botticelli called Madonna of the Pomegranate. I'm also really interested in works from this time of the deep symbolism and the use of color and objects. So not only do I think a lot about language and terminology and dig in deep to the meaning of words or the duality of words, but I also like to look at symbols and investigate their significance. And I use that quite a bit in my work. But I also look at a lot of contemporary works. And so moving into my current long-term work, I'm really interested in traditional women's craft. And there were artists like Faith Ringgold, which is the quilt on the right there, the use of craft for storytelling purposes, but also for fine art purposes. And growing up in the South, if you're familiar at all, quilting is huge. Any kind of women's craft is really significant, significantly influential culturally. So on to Epiphany. So I looked up this word, and of course I have my own interpretation when I think of this word, but I just like to dig in of whatever my initial notion is, look further and deeper at the meaning. So I was looking up the definitions of Epiphany in anticipation for this Sunday. Epiphany, the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles as represented by the Magi in Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. A manifestation of a divine or supernatural being. A moment of sudden revelation or insight. And then from the Greek, it means essentially to reveal. That one to me was like the most startling and wasn't one I had been thinking about actively, but felt so appropriate. So as I mentioned, I had listened to a podcast that was about science, and I'd been thinking about it for years until I started to actively make work dealing with my relationship with my child. And so that for me was my aha moment. For me, in this work, there's a lot of that, a lot of aha moments. And I will say, just in terms of my practice as an artist, even though that science part of me, that left brain aspect of me, I like things that are very orderly. I like to perfect process. My colleagues laugh at me because I like to keep calendars and lists and binders. And that's that left side of my brain working and needing that order to process things. And when I start a project, I start with experimentation in the studio. I have an idea, initial thought of what I might like to do, and then I play, and I see what happens. And I often come across these epiphanies of, okay, like finally what I'm trying to communicate visually is coming through in my work. I'm not going to go into the full backstory of everything that led to this particular epiphany, but in 2018, that is the epiphany that really started this project that I've termed Notions and Impressions. And so, as I mentioned, it's exploring motherhood. But when I think about myself, I have to unpack a lifetime of experiences and influences, especially being raised in the South, initially being raised in the Episcopal Church, being raised through my education as an artist. Think about what is this mother figure? And so I kept coming back to this idea of the Madonna. And so early in this project, I'm often putting myself in that place. And not that I'm actively always looking at and examining images of the Madonna and then making a photograph of myself, but it's sitting there and influencing me in my subconscious. And so I think a lot and consider gesture and emotion. And I especially, because it's photography, we must have light. Can't have a photograph without light. I'm thinking about lighting and the significance of it when I'm creating each of my images. So this particular process I'm using is called cyanotype. It's also known maybe a little more commonly as blueprint. So if you're familiar with the old way that architects used to make their architectural designs as blueprints, it's the same process, but it started as a photographic process. And so it's considered a historical process that I use. What makes this process incredibly interesting to me is that it's not always on paper. You can apply this liquid emulsion to any natural surface and some artificial surfaces, but it works best on natural surfaces. So paper is often a material, a substrate that people use, but also we can apply it to wood, you can apply it to glass, and in my case, I started applying it to fabric. And so this particular image, you see an example, a version of it over here, but this is a found object. It's a handkerchief that I found in an antique store. And so I started playing with applying this material, this photographic process to this material to test out and see what I could get from it. One of the things that I found that I really enjoyed is not only am I using a material that for many, especially from where I come from, are very familiar with. I mean, I knew many, many people growing up that still carried handkerchiefs in their pockets, not just the older generation, but people I was in school with regularly carried handkerchiefs. And when I think about that material, I think about the intimacy of it, how we used it, and if I think historically, the care that was given to create this small piece of artwork to be used in the everyday. And so I'm really interested in appropriating that notion of care. I also really enjoy this process because I never know what I'm going to get, because I'm using all found objects. I'm losing that control when I work with this process because of the substrate. It's all found. I can't replicate it exactly. And so each image I make, even when it's from the same negative, comes across slightly different. So what happens when I combine an image with a printed handkerchief versus a white handkerchief? What kind of relationship am I building in the work based on the material that I'm using? This is an image of my daughter. And when I first started this project, I'll also mention that a lot of it was spent time observing. I think often in this project about the roles of being the observer and the observed in a mother-child relationship. How much time as a parent we watch and are taking care and trying to notice different things that are happening in their lives to kind of help protect them. And one of the things that I actively did not want to do because of my own baggage, my own experiences, I didn't want my child to have the same notions that I had, to feel the same way about certain things, both culturally, personally, and just like silly everyday things. I didn't want to put that on her. And so I really had to step back and let go of control. Another aha moment in this project for me was when I decided I really wanted to make larger imagery. So handkerchiefs, if you've not seen them before, if you've not interacted with them in person, they generally are only 10.5 inches square to maybe 13 inches square. So in art, that's pretty small. In photography these days, that's pretty small. And so I wanted to expand the scale of the work. That was my initial intent, is I just want to make it bigger. And so I started to print on multiple handkerchiefs to make larger pieces. What that forced me to do, though, was to think about, number one, how am I going to assemble these various prints together? But also, as I'm combining these different layers, how does that change the meaning of the work? What else am I incorporating into the work by combining them? And so one of the things that I started to do was explore hand embroidery in this particular project. This wasn't new to me. I've been working with hand embroidery since I first learned how to sew when I was in middle school. And so this has been a lifelong incorporation throughout my work. Off and on, but I really intently started to study and practice different types of designs. And I needed to think about what was the significance of that. And so I often use embroidery almost like a hidden language that's talking about the relationship between my daughter and myself, how we balance each other, but oftentimes how there's breaks, or it's not continuous, it's shifting over time. And so you see little shifts in the embroidery that are occurring. So when I'm creating my collages, this is an image, a couple images from when I was at an artist residency. I tend to do this in the summer. That's my high work time. I spread out. So I often might have an idea for an image that's influenced by things that I've experienced with my child, things that I've observed culturally, but I don't know past that image what I'm going to do with the work. And so I just continue this idea of play and experimentation until I find something that fits together. And so whatever space I have, I'm going to spread out and see what I can do with it. So as I've continued this project and started to expand into these collages, my daughter is continuing to get older, and I will say, like, one of the reasons I didn't start this project sooner is that I was very hesitant about her stakes in this project and her participation, her active participation. I didn't want to just make images and her not have a choice in them, and I want her to feel comfortable with what we're doing together. And so until she was old enough to kind of recognize like her role in it, I didn't want to make her a participant. But as she gets older, we start to work together when we're making photographs. She gives suggestions, I listen, we try that out, and so she feels much more invested in what I'm doing. So I'm also continuing to think about symbolism. This particular work, there's a famous sculpture in the background that's kind of blurred out that's looming over the photograph of my daughter. It's called Abundance. And so thinking about not only objects, but the environment, how this can relate to what I'm trying to communicate about us as individuals, but also our experience together. You'll notice I incorporate not only hand embroidery, but I'm also intentionally incorporating florals throughout the work. So thinking about themes of fertility, cycles of life, and how that connects to the two of us, what it represents about us. Thinking about seasons, how does that speak to our relationship? And as my daughter gets older, she's becoming much more independent, and I have to think again about who I am as an individual. Thinking ahead, she's in middle school now, so thinking ahead to when she's going to leave home and be a full-fledged adult, and how does that change my identity then? So I'm starting to think towards the future, creating a lot of work that's very self-reflective, especially in moments when I can be in environments that really speak to me, that call for moments of meditation. And I will say that when I'm making my work, I spend a lot of time thinking. I'm very, very slow. I will make things in batches and I'll make a lot of things, but to finish work, I need a lot of time to think. What is it this work is saying to me? What do I want it to say to the viewer? How do I want to relate it within the art historical context and the photographic history context? And so there's a lot that I consider as I'm making work. And because I'm slow and I don't work very quickly, I have lots of time, lots of moments to really ponder the significance of what I want to say. This particular work is called Hearth. And so again, thinking about symbolism, it's difficult to see in the image, and the intent is for you not necessarily to understand the space that I'm inhabiting, but I stumbled upon in the woods of the North Carolina mountains this abandoned chimney, and it just had like essentially this, it was almost like an altar laid out in front of it. And so I just was kind of residing within that space and taking these portraits and thinking later about the significance of the hearth to the home, this place that we use for warmth, this place that's been used historically for food, and is often a gathering space for families. But I'm residing within that alone. And so really thinking again about what my place is within my home and how that's going to change across time. Oh, it is working. Okay. Oh, great. I tested this earlier and I didn't see it moving. I was like, oh, darn, that stinks. Okay, so I can talk about that. All right, so when I display these works, I have one up here, but it's not really representational of what it looks like in a gallery space. When I display these, I hang them about 3 to 4 inches away from the wall. And so another element in the experience of seeing the work in person is the natural movement created by air currents in the space, just people moving back and forth, gently walking around a gallery space. Air currents from the air conditioning or the heating system slowly blowing and moving the work so that it starts to bring it to life. And so this has become an important aspect, and it's another one of those aha moments that not only for me in making the work and trying to bring it to life, but hopefully for the viewer when they see the work in person. All right, so the last one I'm going to share with you all is this one. So still thinking about historical figures and drawing upon that influence and symbolism. This particular image, the bottom portion came from a sculpture in Greece, in Italy. It's a statue of Minerva. And so when I think about these historical figures and their symbolism, I'm doing a lot of research and trying to understand and again unpack, like, what is the significance and how does that relate to myself and my child? So Minerva was a Roman goddess known for wisdom, justice, law, victory, and was also the sponsor of arts, trade, and strategy. Her domain was of music, poetry, medicine, commerce, weaving, and crafts. And so it just felt so poignant to select works like this to combine with my daughter. When I think about the history that she holds, that she's not only carrying what I've taught her, she's carrying what she's learned. She's also someone who's very artistic herself. And so thinking about how these different symbols overlap with who she is as an individual. All right, that's all I wanted to share today.
Wow. That's so great. Let's have our talk show. I wish we had another hour or so to talk. We have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Yes.
However, so I have one sort of comment question, and then if we have time, I hope that you all will ask questions as well. So the slow thing really intrigues me. So throughout this series, we've sort of been reflecting on the fact that artists work very much in a mode that is like prayer. Maybe even sometimes it is prayer. So I'm thinking about the slowness, though, and I would say, there was this movement about 10 years ago, like slow food, slow television. Everybody's sort of pushing to slow down and sort of be deliberate about the things that we do in life. So slow art and slow faith, I think, have so much in common. I think one of the reasons that people are drawn to the Episcopal Church and to the liturgy is that it's slow faith. It's not instantaneous. We don't promise overnight results. We see this as a process, right? So you're a cradle Episcopalian. So I'm just wondering if the experience of the liturgy from your childhood had anything to do with your ability to have this slow art as well.
That's a really good question, I think, and I will, just to bring some context to that, I was born in the Episcopal Church, and I stayed in the Episcopal Church until high school. And in talking to other Episcopalians, they've had a very similar experience. I had a teeny tiny church, and there were only 1 or 2 other kids my age. Yeah. And that was what was always really difficult. I had friends growing up in the Baptist churches in the South, which were huge, just like here. And so they had huge communities, huge youth groups, and that was something that, for me, was lacking. Yeah. And so my parents are divorced, and my father converted to a non-denominational, the Church of Christ. And so they had a big youth group. And so I switched to that and was part of that for many years. Yeah. The thing that was missing for me was the experience of the Episcopal Church. It is so beautiful. And to me, coming to church and just being a part of the service, I feel like I'm connecting to God. I'm connecting on another plane. And that is the intent of that space. Yeah. And so I do think that there is certainly a connection there. I think many artists would agree that you, as an artist, you create this space, this environment that allows you that room and that time to slowly come to terms with what you're trying to do. And you may not get to it today, you may not get to it 5 years from now. It may take 20 years for you to fully understand everything you were trying to do, but it takes that meditation and constant thought in order to connect with what you're doing. So I certainly think my experiences growing up of listening and observing and being oftentimes having moments of quiet and rest and then of activity is certainly influential and reflective of what my experiences are as an art maker.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think about the depth, right? And the fact that, as we've been talking about, art both reveals and conceals. It is not a thing that sort of opens its meaning up to you immediately, right? And says, okay, here's the one-to-one correspondence. Like, this is what everything means. And that's also, of course, our approach in the Episcopal Church to faith and theology and the way we read the Bible and all of those things, right? We dig in. We keep digging in, and we know we're not going to plumb the depths and figure everything out. But that, I know it's really a cheesy cliche, but like the journey is the destination in that sense. And I think that's true in all art, but I can see that in your work as well. Yeah. Any questions from the Peanut Gallery? Yes. Go ahead, Andy. Yeah.
I think it's a matter of both, and I will say I think it depends on the project. For me, this particular project is a lot of epiphanies. Because I'm so controlling, like photo has been a perfect medium to balance my personality, but because I'm working with unique materials, I have to let go of that control. I have to embrace the mistakes more than I've ever had to in my entire life. And like when you're teaching photography, if you make a mistake somewhere, there's no fixing it. Like you got to start from step one and begin again. And so it really requires like slowness, it requires contemplation, and it requires study. And so for me, like that was a big epiphany in this project is like, I have some aspects of that, but having to let it go. In terms of the epiphany of what the project is about, like the meaning behind the work, that's ongoing. I mean, there's a lot that I understand about what I do because I spend so much time thinking about it, but there's still so much more that just through conversations, or even like for this talk today, this is very different. Like how the headspace I had to get into for this is very different than how I would typically introduce this material. And I'm also like trying to fit in like a lot of information, but quickly. We normally get like 45 minutes to an hour to talk about our work. So I had to be a little bit more precise in how I'm trying to connect it to what I saw as a strong overlap with this particular season in the church. So I think it just depends, and I think for this project, it's both aspects. There's epiphany in making the work, and there's epiphany for me in creating the work. And what the intent, what the ideas are within the work.
Gosh, and even when you said mistake, right, you sort of redefine what a mistake is, even. You have these happy accidents, I'm sure. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Linda?
When you say mistake, have you ever done one when you've looked through the lens and taken this picture and say, oh, that's not it, but then after you continue, you find out it really was it? That was something that...
I don't recall a particular instance where I came back to an image for that project that I had kind of discarded. I will say there are images that then sometimes lead into another project, that lead me down another path, and I'll use them for that instead. Or like I also have, which is terrible for a photographer, I have terrible eyesight. So I often have to re-photograph things because I just couldn't focus on the exact point that I want. And so I use, especially like my cell phone or initial photographs with my camera, as almost like sketches. And I'm like trying out ideas. I look at them on the computer or process the film if I'm working with film, and then see what I need to refine. And so it's this constant, like if you think about writing, it's this constant drafting and editing process. So sometimes it's not that I'm trying to get the perfect image in the first photograph, but it's like I'm building from that idea.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much, Morgan, for being with us. I encourage you, if you have time,